Because understanding great literature is better than trying to read and understand yet another business book. On the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, we commit to reading, dissecting, and analyzing the great books of the Western canon. You know, those books, from Jane Austen to Shakespeare, and everything else in between, that you might have fallen asleep trying to read in high school. We do this for our listeners, the owner, the entrepreneur, the manager, or the civic leader who doesn't have the time to read, dissect, analyze, and leverage insights from literature to execute leadership best practices in the confusing and chaotic postmodern world we all now inhabit. Welcome to the rescuing of Western civilization at the intersection of literature and leadership. Welcome to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. Hello, my name is Hasan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 110. With our book today, a book that is widely considered to be one of the cornerstones of Holocaust literature. It describes in lyrical detail, as Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl did, which we covered on episode number 68 with Richard Messing, the ways in which individuals are gradually and imperceptibly robbed of their humanity by the state. During this month, we've addressed on the podcast the idea of where a leader's moral compass emanates from. And this book answers two other questions, which actually probably come before that question. And they are of equal importance. What does a leader do to preserve his or her moral compass when morality and character are effectively placed on the back burner? And number two, how can a leader rebuild a destroyed moral center? The hard-earned lessons from the apocalyptic wars of the 20th century that ended with atomic finality at Hiroshima and Nagasaki seem to be losing their power to emotionally scare us now in the early 21st century. From Russia invading the Ukraine to China saber rattling in the Western Pacific, the drums are beating gradually for an escalation to worldwide warfare again. The quote-unquote health of the state, according to the progressive socialist author Randolph Bourne back in the day. The people, the policymakers, pundits, politicians, and even the public tastemakers pounding these war drums seem inured to the lessons laid out so clearly in this book that we are going to cover today. They are historically and generationally removed far enough from the visceral nature of the horrors of the Holocaust, the rape of Nanking, and the Ukrainian Holodomor. Their insistence that humanity stroll yet again down the well-worn path that leads eventually to the clearing where these horrors lie, in light of this book, reads like naive ignorance at best and craven self-serving manipulation at worst. And this is why we need books like this and conversations like the one we're going to have today in order to pull all this apart and put it in its appropriate context. Today, we will be exploring the clearing at the end of the path, the weakness of a nihilistic worldview when genuine totalizing evil manifests itself in the world, and the utter banality of evil as we cover Night by Elie Wiesel. Leaders, beware of tyrants. Unlike most people you know, they tend to ruthlessly keep their promises. And today, in this journey, we will be joined by two folks. You're going to hear two voices on the podcast today. And of course, if you're watching the video, you're going to see two folks on the video. And it'll be kind of a little bit of a panel discussion today. So we're joined by our previous guest co-hosts, Libby Unger and Ryan J. Stout. How you doing, Ryan and Libby? How's it going?
Great. Best day of my life.
Best day of your life to be talking about a truly
How are you, Hasan?
Impactful book. How am I? Well, it's the merry month of June, right? So we're gonna get into Night. We're gonna get into Elie Wiesel. I had not read this book. I don't know how I had missed it. in all my time. But it's one of those books that it's sort of like your vegetables. Everybody tells you that it's good to read or that you should read it. And of course, it's part of a much larger biography of Eli and his experiences in the concentration camps during World War II. But it was a book that I had not up until this point read. And the version that I have has an Oprah Winfrey quote on the cover of it. And I usually I take the Jonathan Franzen approach to an Oprah Winfrey quote on the cover of her book. And I run away from it. But this book, just like East of Eden, will be fine with or without Oprah. Doesn't need Oprah to make it any better. So yeah, it was a very impactful book for me, and I hope that it will be impactful for us today as we talk about it and pull it apart. And I'm going to find out from you all what you all thought of it as well. So we're going to open from Night. And we're going to read directly from the book today. I don't think Eli would actually object to us reading directly from the book. As a matter of fact, I think he would probably want us to. So we're going to start early in Night here and talk about Moishe the beetle. One day, as I was about to enter the synagogue, I saw Moishe the beetle sitting on a bench near the entrance. He told me what had happened to him and his companions. The train with the deportees had crossed the Hungarian border and, once in Polish territory, had been taken over by the Gestapo. The train had stopped. The Jews were ordered to get off and onto the waiting trucks. The trucks headed toward a forest. There, everybody was ordered to get out. They were forced to dig huge trenches. When they had finished their work, the men from the Gestapo began theirs. Without passion or haste, they shot their prisoners, who were forced to approach the trench one by one and offer their necks. Infants were tossed into the air and used as targets for the machine guns. This took place in the Galician forest near Colome. How had he, Moishe the beetle, been able to escape? By a miracle. He was wounded in the leg and left for dead. Day after day, night after night, he went from one Jewish house to the next, telling his story and that of Malka, the young girl who lay dying for 3 days, and that of Toby, the tailor who begged to die before his sons were killed. Moishe was not the same. The joy in his eyes was gone. He no longer sang. He no longer mentioned either God or Kabbalah. He spoke only of what he had seen. But people not only refused to believe his tales, they refused to listen. Some even insinuated that he only wanted their pity, that he was imagining things. Others flatly said that he had gone mad. As for Moishe, he wept and pleaded, "Jews, listen to me. That's all I ask of you. No money, no pity. Just listen to me." He kept shouting in synagogue between the prayer at dusk and the evening prayer. Even I did not believe him. I often sat with him after services and listened to his tales, trying to understand his grief, but all I felt was pity. "They think I'm mad," he whispered, and tears like drops of wax flowed from his eyes. Once I asked him the question, "Why do you want people to believe you so much? In your place, I would not care whether they believed me or not." He closed his eyes as if to escape time. "You don't understand," he said in despair. "You cannot understand. I was saved miraculously. I succeeded in coming back. Where did I get my strength? I wanted to return to Siget to describe to you my death, so that you might ready yourselves while there is still time. Life? I no longer care to live. I am alone. But I wanted to come back to warn you. Only no one is listening to me." This was towards the end of 1942. Thereafter, life seemed normal again. London radio, which we listened to every evening, announced encouraging news: the daily bombing of Germany and Stalingrad, the preparation of the Second Front. And so we, the Jews of Signet, waited for better days that were surely soon to come. I continued to devote myself to my studies, Talmud during the day and Kabbalah at night. My father took care of his business in the community. My grandfather came to spend Rosh Hashanah with us so as to attend the services of the celebrated Rebbe of Borscht. My mother was beginning to think it was high time to find an appropriate match for Hilda. Thus passed the year 1943. Eleazar Elie Wiesel, born September 30th, 1928, died July 2nd, 2016, was a Romanian-born American writer, professor, political activist, Nobel laureate, and Holocaust survivor. Wiesel's father, Shlomo, instilled a strong sense of humanism in his son, encouraging him to learn Hebrew and to read literature, whereas his mother encouraged him to study the Torah. Wiesel said his father represented reason, while his mother, Sarah, promoted faith. Wiesel had 3 siblings, older sisters Beatrice and Hilda, and a younger sister, Zipporah. Beatrice and Hilda survived the war and were reunited with Wiesel at a French orphanage. Wiesel was 15, and he, with his family, along with the rest of the town's Jewish population, was placed in one of 2 confinement ghettos set up in Szeged, the town where he had been born and raised. In May 1944, the Hungarian authorities, under German pressure, began to deport the Jewish community to the Auschwitz concentration camp, where up to 90% of people were murdered on arrival. It's interesting that I'm reading this book now. I'm also reading another book, which you will cover on the podcast a little bit later on this month, or perhaps maybe later on this year. Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. And when you read that book about Adolf Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem in the 1960s, what you begin to realize is that the Hungarians were the last out of all the European countries to actually start solving the Jewish problem. And yes, they did it under German pressure. They were unwilling to go as far as the Germans wanted them to go. But the second that the Germans told them that this was the direction that they were going to be going in, the Hungarian authorities were all too eager to start shipping their Jews to concentration camps. One other note about this book, Elie Wiesel, as an author, wrote a much longer version of this. It's divided into 3 parts. So night, day, and then I believe the other part is dawn. And it's a much larger book. And it took him, probably about 10 to 12 years after he was released from the concentration camps to actually be able to put some of the things in words that he had experienced directly as a 15, 16, and 17-year-old. His mother and his oldest sister, his mother and his youngest sister did not survive the concentration camps. Neither did his father, Shlomo. And the father's death is described in brutal detail in Night. And there's a lot of details in here that are disturbing. And so we're going to cover some of them today. So this is fair warning right at the beginning that we're going to get into some stuff here. But I want to put forth the first question to both Ryan and Libby, and we can kind of bounce this question back and forth. I don't care who goes first today. It doesn't really matter. Let's talk a little bit about the literary life of Elie Wiesel, the impact of Night, what you know about this book, what you'd heard about this book. Let's talk a little bit about that just to sort of open here. And either one can begin.
This, I am I travel around a lot. I'm just, been around. And so books just show up in my book. It's like kind of has like a magnet. And just like one day, I have no idea how it got there. Night was there. Just kind of in my collection of books. And I moved to Cincinnati about 2.5 years ago. And I was like, this is probably a book I should read. And kind of like what your opening statement was. I was like, I read that, I didn't really know much about it or the writer. And that's the book I read when I first moved in. As far as the, I love when writers can write so poignantly and so powerfully. Camus does that really well. And using the simple language and describing those like grotesque scenes and almost allowing the reader to kind of plug in information as well. He's just providing the specifics of the details to give I believe a necessary insight into the capabilities of humankind on both ends of that. So it's
Yeah. I had not read it. I am a Oprah Winfrey fan. My favorite book, The Untethered Soul, came from her, and it started my own journey, to a whole nother level. I think I'm on Libby 11.0 or 12.0 at this point, and she got me at like 3.0. But I think I avoided it because there was already so much that we knew about the Holocaust, and it was just too much to take in. And actually reading the book, it was very difficult. It brought me to tears at many times, just thinking about what humans could do to each other. The honesty that he had as well, as he moved through the camps. When you're on Maslow's pyramid of needs and you're all the way at the bottom, all of us can lose. It's just about getting food. I think they say after 3 days with no water, all of us could turn to ferocity, and that we're not that far away from being feral ourselves. But it was incredibly moving. It also was really hard to read in light of what we've just experienced for the last 4 years, and and not knowing things weren't right, but not knowing what truths to believe. And when he wasn't believing Beetle, and he was warning, how many of those warnings do we get as well that are false, and we over index on believing are true, or are true and and we don't believe. So it's very poignant for a lot of reasons for the last 4 years, and then in the last 6 months, what folks were warning about kind of emerged, and not from where you expected it to. So it's really it was very interesting. I read the version that his wife translated, and so it was I don't know, like 20 or 30 years after he wrote it, and I like that the description that he gave is that I understand English better now, and so I can give a little more flavor. Those are my words, flavor to what happened. But it's powerful. I don't want to read it again. I think everyone should. I don't know why this book touched me much more than any war books or movies. I am someone who covers my eyes in war movies, so but I'm not brought to tears, and this one brought me to tears thinking about what humans could do to humans. And maybe it's because it's so close to our history, and we know I know so many people touched by it.
It is written in a very clear, to Ryan's point, a very clear, deceptively simplistic language. There's not a lot of flowery description in this narrative at all. Obviously autobiographical, obviously being driven by what he directly experienced. Ryan, you're a writer, and you've done a fair bit of writing yourself. How hard is it to like strip away sort of the meaningless fluff, right? And Libby and I talked about this a little bit with The Sun Also Rises, and with Ernest Hemingway, we covered Hemingway. But I'd like to get your thoughts on this, because as a writer, how do you look at what Wiesel has done here?
Epic, because I said you and I think it was 70. I wrote you a 75-word sentence. And so being direct is not really the strong suit of a writer such as myself. I think that's where like maybe songs or poetry comes in, something like that. But you can even twist words around even more so. It's because it's just an abstraction of an abstraction of an abstraction. And it becomes this you know, sort of like flowery thing, like the kid Hillel I was talking about earlier. He had used to cry when he was younger, uncontrollably, and so it was like a really big deal when he was in school. Roughly, he would just cry and cry and cry, and so and he would talk about it. And I saw a video on his iPad, and it was him as like a 7-year-old or 6-year-old, and he's like, and now, and he was getting his like crying under control, and he's like, and now I'm gonna give you a tear. And he closes his eyes and a tear runs down his face. And I'm like, bro, I'm a poet. You can't show that to me, dude. I'm almost. So are you kidding? You're going to give me a tear? Oh my goodness gracious. So from that end of things, yes, it has. And that's just one simple thing. And I feel like the writing too, maybe it's so visceral. It's like you just hear this one thing and it's so connected to, you know, and it's also so far away from what most people can relate to is affecting our lives immediately. So it is such a horrible, horrible thing to even imagine and consider. Another thing that I thought,
yeah, I mean, it was really matter of fact, you know, and he didn't it's what you would observe if you were just in it, right? Like you wouldn't have time to be flowery either or think about how you feel about it. You'd just be observing it. And I think that was, you know, why it was so poignant. You know, he didn't explain anything. He just told you how he saw, really saw it.
The one of the other things we talk about Moishe the Beetle. I was thinking of like kind of the sagacious person. It's the sage of the play. You know, it's the farewell. You know, giving the warning. And it was just. And then we were talking. Libby, you brought up like what to sort of believe and tease and tether out. And it's like so. It is difficult. You have this kind of clairvoyance saying, "Hey, this is coming," and it's like, "Yeah, that's a crazy person." And how often we just say that's a crazy person and dismiss them because it's so kind of unrelatable or just fantastical at the particular moment. And it made me think about how animals are never. You never see like graveyards of animals from natural disasters. This is clearly like the Holocaust. There's a spiritual malady happening, and I think that's the. Kind of maybe the through line of what's happening currently, this kind of the spiritual brokenness and kind of to be plugged into that is I think kind of it.
I think that the thing that's so hard is so many of us could not imagine it. So if it's not in your heart or your head to even imagine that a human has that capacity, you would think that they're crazy, right? Like it, I mean, I have bad thoughts, but I could never, they would never fall in the realm of what he saw and experienced, like what they did to babies and, you know, and putting like it, I can't even say it because it doesn't, I can't even fathom it. But that's why I think people don't believe is because they can't believe what they can't imagine. You know, and then we have movies that just, you know, have you so far detached from it being real that it just seems fantastical. And they didn't have movies or meaningful movies back then. But I think if you can't imagine it, I also think the reason he could have hope on the other side is because he also saw true goodness in humanity, right? Even with the evil, he saw he saw goodness. And so there was enough from a goodness perspective to keep him moving forward.
Well, one of the things that we're going to talk about today is, and Libby, you kind of touched on it. Ryan, you touched a little bit on it. And we are going to address it. I mean, it is in our notes today to talk about the resurgence of anti-Semitism in our time, which is disturbing to me at multiple levels. And I don't, well, anyway, we'll talk about that coming up here because there's no possible way you could talk about this book without talking about anti-Semitism. Mm-mm. But I, like I said before, I'm also reading Hannah Arendt's, Eichmann in Jerusalem, right? Her reporting on the trial of Adolf Eichmann. I'm reading this parallel at the same time that I'm reading Night. And one of the challenges, and Jordan Peterson talks about this sometimes, and it is a good point. He says, if you can't imagine yourself doing some of these things, then you probably don't know your own capacity for evil. And he's a person who came to social prominence through psychologically wanting to solve the problem of evil. And the Holocaust, even more so than Stalin's gulags, which killed far more people, by the way. And Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote about this in the Gulag Archipelago, and we've covered that book on this podcast. But the Holocaust strikes us at so much more of a visceral level, even though Stalin stacked up way more bodies than Hitler. And I'm not being facetious about that. This is just an
Mao
issue
did
of
too.
right. Just Mao, right? Oh my gosh, Mao, right? Top 3 mass murderers of the 20th century, right? And yet we are stunned into silence by the Holocaust in the West, anyway. Now, in other places of the world, specifically, what the heck? I'm going to go ahead and go for it. Specifically in the more Muslim or Islamic parts of the world, no one is stunned into silence by the Holocaust. It's either dismissed, or it's shrugged off, or it's called a myth, or it's called and we'll talk about this again coming up here in a little bit, a Zionist conspiracy. And none of those dogs hunt for me. And I don't think they hunt for any rational human being. Wiesel got to something in the human heart, which is a larger thing that we're going to talk about coming up here too, I think. Or not, I know we're going to talk about coming up here. He got to something that exists in the human heart. And it starts with that, I think, that lack of belief in the Cassandra, the prophet that's going to tell you the future. Ryan, you called it clairvoyant. I prefer the old Greek idea of a Cassandra, or a canary in a coal mine. Moija was a canary in a coal mine, right? And, I think one of the reasons why why people got so visceral over COVID in this country was because we don't want to be fooled again. We have this narrative in our head. And one of the things that disturbs me greatly and concerns me greatly with the rise of anti-Semitism is that not enough people who are, say, under 35 seem to have that thing in their head.
Right.
And I don't know if that's a failure of the education system. I don't know if that's a failure of parenting in a family. I don't know if it's a failure of not reading these books. I went to Half Price Books to pick up my copy of Night with this specific cover, and there were like 50 copies there. It's not like you can't get the information. It's not like you can't read it. So I guess my question is, how do we get more people to be touched by this? I mean, I'm doing my part talking about it right now, but how do we get more people to be touched by this?
It has to be sort of woven somehow into the current narrative of social importance, and kind of probably abstracted in a way. So it may enter as as something about the Holocaust, but it may be extracted into something else that doesn't even mean sort of. All right, so do you know how the Proud Boys started?
It
was a
no,
it was,
I have no
it
idea.
was a joke. It was a joke.
Okay.
It was a joke. Gavin McGinnis is working at this the studio, and one of their tech guys was this 19 or 20-year-old Jewish kid, and he went to
We've been having trouble with Ryan's audio coming in and out.
I know.
We'll see if he comes back. Go ahead, Libby.
Yeah, I don't know this. I don't know the story of the Proud Boys either.
I don't either.
Or how prominent they are. That's the question that I also have. Get. Oh, are you there? Oh, good.
Yeah, I'm gonna go.
There we go.
And so this song came on, and it was like the big encore song of the play, and it was "You're a Proud Boy," and Gavin McInnes was just kind of teasing this dude, and we should start a club called the Proud Boys. And so they would like go to bars and drink and just do like dude stuff, and that was it. And then Gavin McInnes would go on speaking engagements, and Tifa would be there, and then like he'd ask the Proud Boys to come, and then it turned into what it turned into, and he's been out of it for a long time. So it started off as a complete joke, and it spiraled into. And so when we talk about kind of like what to believe, and this does not get fooled again, and if it's so pervasive that it could spawn something can spawn out of something so tiny.
I actually think that speaks to something bigger about the abuse of institutions. So those who tend to want power aren't those who should have it. I don't want to touch on the Proud Boys too much because I don't know enough about it, but the idea being that it got popular based off of one thing, and then like kind of like BLM got infiltrated too, with the Marxists. Does Proud Boys get infiltrated and then taken somewhere it doesn't, that the original folks didn't want it to go? I have friends whose kids are at Harvard, and they the different groups also got kind of hijacked. And when you're that young, you don't know how to fight it, or the import of it, because you're still in that I need to belong. I'm fortunate that I've always been allergic to tribalism since the age of since third grade. But a lot of folks don't know how, like, belonging is so important to them, especially on the female side, unfortunately. That they get caught up in something and they don't know how to get out because their identity is so tied up with what it previously was. And they have friends now that are promoting things they didn't believe in, but they don't want to not belong because they may be the only outsider. So you have so many different human dynamics that are at play, but we do see how a lot of positive institutions like Congress got taken over by those who you want to use power for their own means, and it sounds like that was, we know that happened with BLM. We know that happens with a lot. That happened probably with Proud Boys. So one of the ways to counter that is always trying to localize things and keep things decentralized.
Well, and one of the things, and it's interesting, you mentioned Proud Boys. It's not necessarily what I would have gone, but it's interesting. I actually just listened to an interview with Gavin McInnes. I can't remember who interviewed him. I listened to a podcast interview with him because I didn't know anything about him. Literally nothing. Like, that's part of the world that I'm blind to. And
he's like the first hipster.
Yeah, right. Yeah, yeah. And I listened to it and I thought, not to be dismissive, because ideas have consequences, right? And that's why we read the book. And this ties into the conversation that we'll have a little bit later around anti-Semitism as well. I want to be very clear. I'm not being dismissive of the ideas behind these kinds of thinkers, right? And these kinds of people who are putting themselves forth in the public era. And two things can be true at one time. And it's like looking at a bad copy of a bad copy, right? Like the level of, I don't want to say commitment, that's not it. The level of trolling, that's the word I'm looking for. Trolling, gaslighting, that's evident in some of these actors' behavior, to Libby, to your point, when they're trying to capture institutions for their own use. They're not serious about it. Himmler was serious. You know, Rudolf Hess was serious. Reinhard Heydrich was serious. It goes without saying that Hitler was serious. You know, these were grown-ups who had been through the First World War, I mean, you know, you can, I was talking to my kid about the history of the First World War, my youngest daughter, and I said, you know, you can say a lot about Hitler, and you should, but you cannot take away from the fact that he did something that was incredibly hard in World War One. He was a runner, and not all those people made it. It was like 80-90% death rate for runners. Mm-hmm. And yet he didn't die, which is weird, right? It's almost as if to the spiritual piece that there were some other things that had to happen in the world with that guy, right? And this does not justify him, nor does it dismiss anything that he did. But he was a grown-up. I listened to that interview with Mr. McGinnis, and I don't get the sense that he's a grown-up. You're not behaving like a mature individual. You're not behaving like you actually understand that your words carry weight and meaning. And by the way, this is the problem I had with BLM too. You're not behaving like you're a grown-up. Like none of you could carry Malcolm X's briefcase, and yet you want to go around and scream about Black nationalism? Get the hell out of town. You haven't earned it. You really haven't. You haven't earned it. So that is the part to me that I kind of struggle with a little bit in these types of conversations. And so I think what gives weight and seriousness, what gives maturity, gravitas, I guess is the word that I'm looking for, to some of these ideas is exploring exactly where these ideas go, which is the value of reading books like this. I'm gonna jump back into the book. Ryan's got to go do something, so he's gonna log off for just a second. Well, not log. He's gonna mute himself, and then he's gonna go do the thing he needs to do. And Libby and I are gonna keep talking here. Back to the book. Back to Night by Elie Wiesel. There was a woman among us, a certain Mrs. Schachter. She was in her 50s, and her 10-year-old son was with her, crouched in a corner. Her husband and 2 older sons had been deported with the first transport by mistake. The separation had totally shattered her. I knew her well. A quiet, tense woman with piercing eyes. She had been a frequent guest in our house. Her husband was a pious man who spent most of his days and nights in the house of study. It was she who supported the family. Mrs. Schachter lost her mind. On the first day of the journey, she had already begun to moan. She kept asking why she had been separated from her family. Later, her sobs and screams became hysterical. On the third night, as we were sleeping, some of us sitting huddled against each other, some of us standing, a piercing cry broke the silence. Fire! I see a fire! I see fire! There was a moment of panic. Who had screamed? It was Mrs. Schachter. Standing in the middle of the car in the faint light filtering through the window, she looked like a withered tree in a field of wheat. She was howling, pointing at the window. Look at this fire, this terrible fire. Have mercy on me. Some pressed against the bars to see. There was nothing, only the darkness of the night. It took a long time to recover from this harsh awakening. We were still trembling, and with every screech of the wheels, we felt the abyss open beneath us. Unable to still our anguish, we tried to reassure each other. She is mad, poor woman. Someone placed a damp rag on her forehead, but she nevertheless continued to scream, Fire! I see a fire. Her little boy was crying, clinging to her skirt, trying to hold her hand. It's nothing, mother. There's nothing there. Please sit down. He pained me even more than did his mother's cries. Some of the women tried to calm her. You'll find your husbands and sons again in a few days. She continued to scream and sob fitfully. Jews, listen to me, she cried. I see a fire. I see flames, huge flames. It was as though she was possessed by some evil spirit. We tried to reason with her, more to calm ourselves, to catch our breath, and to soothe her. She is hallucinating because she is thirsty, poor woman. That's why she speaks of flames devouring her. But it was all in vain. Our terror could no longer be contained. Our nerves had reached breaking point. Our very skin was aching. It was as though madness had infected all of us. We gave up. A few young men forced her to sit down, then bound and gagged her. Silence fell again. The small boy sat next to his mother, crying. I started to breathe normally again as I listened to the rhythmic pounding of the wheels and the tracks of the train racing through the night. We could begin to doze again, to rest, to dream. And so an hour or two passed. Another scream jolted us. The woman had broken free of her bonds and was shouting louder than before. Look at the fire. Look at the flames. Flames everywhere. Once again, the young men bound and gagged her. When they actually struck her, people shouted their approval. Keep her quiet. Make that mad woman shut up. She's not the only one here. She received several blows to the head, blows that could have been lethal. Her son was clinging desperately to her, not uttering a word. He was no longer crying. The night seemed endless. By daybreak, Mrs. Schachter had settled down, crouching in her corner, her blank gaze fixed on some faraway place. She no longer saw us. She remained like that all day, mute, absent, alone in the midst of us. Toward evening, she began to shout again. The fire over there. She was pointing somewhere in the distance, always the same place. No one felt like beating her anymore. The heat, the thirst, the stench, the lack of air were suffocating us. Yet all that was nothing compared to her screams, which tore us apart. A few more days, and all of us would have started to scream. But we were pulling into a station. Someone near a window read to us, Auschwitz. Nobody had ever heard that name. When you read the stories of folks who survived the Holocaust, one of the things that jumps out at you, actually, there's two big things that jump out at you. I want to talk a little bit about this idea with Libby and Ryan. And we are going to pull leadership lessons from Elie Wiesel and from Knight, because there are lessons for leaders from this book. One of the big ones we actually just covered, which I think is you have to know history and be mature and be responsible for your ideas and where they go, clearing at the end of the path where they might lie. I think another lesson for leaders is that you're going to have two responses to things that happen to you, two reactions. And they could be summed up, these two reactions can be summed up in a couple of quotes, one that comes directly from Knight and another one that comes from Yitzhak Zuckerman. He was a Jewish resistance fighter and a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. And it's a quote that stuck with me for many years, and I thought about it when I was reading this book. He said, if you could lick my heart, it would poison you. The amount of bitterness that he carried from the things that he saw happen to him and the things that he saw happen to people that he loved. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising occurred in Warsaw, Poland. And that was the one time, and it's actually talked about in Eichmann in Jerusalem, that was one of very rare number of times when the Jewish leaders did not cooperate with the National Socialists in their own destruction. One of the more disturbing things that you read about in Eichmann in Jerusalem is just how easy it was for the Nazis, the Germans, to get Jewish leaders to save Jews that were of a certain social class and allow other Jews to just go to Auschwitz. In Knight, the second idea is there, which is expressed by a concentration camp member that Wiesel was in a hospital bed next to in Buna, because he was transported around, as many Jews were, to several different concentration camps. And at Buna, he had to go into the hospital, and so he was put in the hospital, and he was there next to a fellow concentration camp member. And this guy said to him, I have more faith in Hitler than anyone else. He alone has kept his promises, all his promises to the Jewish people. You're going to have one of two reactions, right? You're either going to drink from the cup of bitterness, and it's going to be like consuming poison and hoping that the other person will die, or you're going to be clear-eyed, right, about what you're actually going through and what's actually happening to you. And you're going to figure out a way to navigate around it, right? There's challenges in our time with not genuine. There's challenges in our time of recognizing the difference between genuinely tyrannical acts and commitments and just political things, right, that are just happening in the moment. How do we, and this is the question for Olivia and Ryan, this is a heavy question. how do we use a book like this to separate out things, to slice and dice and separate political rhetoric from genuine tyrannical commitments? How do we use this text to raise our awareness? There's a lot of talk about raising awareness, or at least there was a few years ago. Okay, everybody wants their awareness raised. All right. That's not a sexy act, because once your awareness is raised and you're responsible for what you do with that awareness, which we don't often talk about that part. So how do we, and I think Wiesel was worried about this too. How do we avoid the cup of bitterness? And then how do we separate momentary political rhetoric from a genuine tyrannical commitment?
From where I
I feel
sit,
like
oh, go
so
ahead.
I feel like a political rhetoric is to serve some other ulterior motive, or be, I don't know, almost like like the propaganda of spreading an idea or something like that, in order to enact, the tyrannical hoped outcome. But Libby, you were saying?
I was just gonna say, like, life is too short to live with, hate and bitterness. I kind of just reject that in my body. You can be cautious, you can be vigilant, but you don't have to hate, and or be bitter. I was really moved by the fire premonition a lot, and it actually takes me back to earlier in our conversation when you were kind of alluding to a spiritual awareness. Is that I think animals feel it, we know it. I can feel darkness when I walk by it or drive by it. I think my dogs can too. And it doesn't have a rhyme or reason to it. I can just feel it. But the ability to distinguish rhetoric from a true tyrant, for me, again, the last 4 years, you can't have open conversations and debate, and you can't have arguments on the merits. That to me, those who are refusing to allow that are the tyrants. Right? If you're not allowing, debate on the merits and even ugly ideas to be out there, then you can never actually see the light as well. And those who shut down conversation are the ones who are most afraid of losing control over their ideas and their way of living. And to me, they're the ones who are, pose the greatest threat.
What is it? So it's, kind of like engage in spirituality is an active way to remedy all the aforementioned. And my sister said something to me one time when I was applying for a job and I went to interview, and kind of gave it a lowdown of what was the exchange of ideas that we had. And she's like, well, and this is where having some sort of like spiritual practice comes in handy, because if you have a series of tenets that you live by, or a series of like moral compass, then the decisions that I'm making are based through that filter and not through anywhere else. It simplifies the playing field, and can, if applied accurately or effectively, can really kind of streamline and the decision-making process. And it's through like the spiritual practice. And I think it is interesting. I was watching physicist. Then he was talking about something being in two places at the same time.
Mhm.
Something. And so you tell people that, and even if you show them a picture, they're like, "Oh, cool." But it's that idea that you were saying earlier, Libby. It's like you can't wrap your head around. Like, no, that's the same thing. That's not two different things. It's the same thing. It's two places at one time, and you kind of just go, okay, because it's so far outside of like, well, most people can grasp in reality, and so that plays into the fact of like the atrocities of what humankind can do to each other.
Mhm.
I think the rhetoric also, when you the othering and division,
Mhm.
like living from a spiritual place, there's love for all. Like, I don't care, what religion you have. I don't care where you grew up. This is one of the reasons as a young child I just had the instinct of not liking organized religion.
Mhm.
And I know this is trite and oversaid, but I had the intuition at a very young age, God would not want us to kill other, others who
Mhm.
didn't think like us, and so Chris Cuomo has a really strong saying that I really like, that it's, when you feel positioning over principles or dogma over principles, then you know that you're in the hands of some folks who may not have the most positive intentions.
Mhm.
And they may not be aware of it, but you never know how far they'll go to retain, the position of being right or in power. So principles, that's what I always gravitate to. Principles, like I belong to lots of different groups, but I'm not dogmatic about any of them. And it's when, with the principles of, love and empowerment and wanting everyone to become the best version of themselves, but empowering them to do that on their own. you
Mhm.
know um for me, it's, always about the principles. And as long as you're not pushing folks out who aren't completely dogmatic, that's a place that feels like a true spiritual place. Or but if you're pushing people out who don't think like you, then you're in a cultish and tyrannical. You have the ability to become tyrannical when you're pushed too far. And the escalation of words and the use of words, I think, is one of the problems we're having right now.
Yeah.
Is that we've escalated the point of all of our words actually have no meaning anymore. So it's hard to determine rhetoric from reality.
Mhm.
Because everyone's Hitler, right? As Candace
Right.
Owens says, I'm tired. Snooze. Just put me on snooze. I don't want to hear about Hitler anymore. Like,
I do. I mean, I have been known to say in the past that, it's become almost, and probably started happening probably about 20 or 30 years ago. It became real easy just to kick Hitler, and that was just a stand-in for all evil everywhere all of the
I
time.
don't think it was. I don't think it was. I think you underestimate the Marxists. Like,
Yes,
they
yes.
never, right?
Right.
Like, you used
Well, yeah.
Hitler. You never were talking about those who killed 100 million,
Right. And
Mao
and
and
this is
Stalin.
right. And this is why we're going to talk about anti-Semitism here in a minute. This is why I think the anti-Semitism on the left, in light of the October 7th intifada from the Palestinians in Israel, has struck such folks politically on the left by surprise. I also think that, and I want to get back to this idea of religion here in a moment, because Wiesel's very interesting on this point. I also think that, to Ryan's point, two things can't be true at the same time. And that tension between those two things is what we're seeking to use language to negotiate. And we're going to do it badly. We're going to do it terribly. And that's why freedom of speech matters. You need to have, to your point, you need to have bad ideas, vetted, right? Um, huh. At a certain point, though, and I've thought this, and I've never said it on this podcast before. but I'll say it now. If you make an idol of freedom of speech, your idol always eventually ends up judging you and judges you harshly. So you got to be careful what you put in that at the top of that hierarchy, or what you worship, or what you allow to push your religious observance. Speaking of religion, Wiesel, when Night opens, he says, he's talking about meeting Moishe the Beetle. And he says, I was almost 13 and deeply observant. By day, I studied the Talmud, and by night, I would run to the synagogue to weep over the destruction of the temple. One day, I asked my father to find me a master who could guide me in my studies of Kabbalah. You are too young for that. Maimonides tells us that one must be 30 before venturing into the world of mysticism, a world fraught with peril. First, you must study the basic subjects, those you are able to comprehend. And it's interesting to watch how Wiesel, who was a deeply observant religious person, how going through the concentration camp and the Holocaust process, and again, I'm not minimizing it, but going through that experience, I won't say, I don't think it denuded him of religion, but I think the organizational parts of it. I mean, he talks about, in the back end of the book, he talks about how in the concentration camp, they believe it was Auschwitz, but it might have been Buna. They celebrated Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and he thought, to what end? Why are we doing this? Look at what we're in. God isn't hearing us. God isn't talking here. There's no judging deity here, and that is one of the challenges. I mean, one of the other books that I'm reading this month as well is Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Letters from Prison. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer was the Lutheran pastor in Nazi Germany, who was probably the most vociferous voice against Hitler, coming out of Lutheranism and coming out of Christianity. And a lot of the Christian church, and this is a huge black eye on the Christian church, not just the Catholic Church, the Christian church in Germany, the Protestant church in Germany, did a lot to help Hitler out. Not a lot of folks stood up and opposed what Hitler was doing. And Bonhoeffer was one of those, all the way to the point where, I believe, if I remember correctly, he was hanged in April of 1945. The Nazis executed him in a concentration camp. And that was probably 3 or 4 months before the concentration camp was liberated by the Russians. And so, he took his principles all the way to the end. We don't really talk about religion on this podcast. We talk about theological stuff, but we don't talk about the construct of religion very much, at all. Wiesel was a religiously observant Jew. I think we can't take that away from him. Before the Holocaust came along and sort of restructured how he looked at that. Organized religion in our time in America is has been restructured. And one of the challenges for particularly churches in America in our time is how to speak to culture, and how to stop things from happening. So, I mean, at a very practical level, right? If you're a pastor reading, Night, what would you recommend? Either Libby or Ryan, what would you recommend that they take from this?
When I think of this book, the image that I think of is him running in the crowd and falling asleep and being asleep and running.
Mm-hmm.
And talking about everyone is kind of communicating and shouting out if people are kind of lagging behind. But also in the same sense, if someone fell, you have to keep going, because if you stopped, you're done too.
Mm-hmm.
So that's that's that age-old the thought experiment, only the train and the tracks and the 5 people in the one and that sort of thing. It's like, but then it always, it's just like the parachute on the plane. It's like, take care of yourself before, you need to be whole before you can take care of anyone else.
Mm-hmm.
So, kind of like at such a young age to keep going, like in those moments, and not necessarily because debating, is he gonna sit there and debate in his head like, okay, this is happening, and kind of like look at from the outer space and look what's happening and kind of like strategically, yeah, just the perseverance of the just kind of unconscionable situations.
Mm-hmm. Hello. So I'm going to do some shilling here, and hopefully this will be a pause in our riveting conversation for you. I have an offer for you. My most recent book is 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership. It's available in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and any other place you order books. Now, in this book, I address the 12 leadership areas that I have found leaders need to be the most intentional in to be the type of leader followers actually want to follow. From establishing a foundation of leading teams through managing conflict effectively, all the way through leading teams through change, knowing what to do and why to do it can help readers, like the ones listening to this show, become better leaders. Look, reading this book and living it is like getting coaching from me directly without having to pay my full coaching rate. Head on over to leadershiptoolbox.us, that's leadershiptoolbox.us, and scroll down the homepage and click on the Buy Now button to purchase in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle format on Amazon 12 Rules for Leaders, the foundation for intentional leadership. And that's it for me. Now back to the show.
For me, it's about the will to survive, and how, innate, innate and resilient, we are. When you have time and safety, you can intellectualize anything. But when you're at that base, the base of the pyramid of needs, your desire to live, is just, is dominant. And I actually find something really inspiring about that.
Mm-hmm.
And and there's no judgment to those who, I don't have judgment for those who can't move forward. Like, I don't know how, they might have been pushing themselves as much as they could, and for factors beyond their own, their body couldn't move on, or or whatever. But we are incredibly resilient, and good will survive, and and evil will too. But I choose to live on the good and continue to express the words of the good.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the power, it's just how strong that will is to survive for many people, that you'll just keep going. I just continue to think of him underneath the bodies and trying to just breathe. And we have no idea what we would do in a situation like if hearing your father crying and wanting to be near you at his last breath, but not wanting to call out because that it's also your death, right? Like, what would you do? I remember, was it in MASH, when the mother ended up suffocating her child because this child was crying, and was going to give up everyone else. We live in a world right now that feels very safe and is intellectually dishonest, because they do not they're just, well, they're playing intellectual games. No one
Mhm.
knows what they would do, if push comes to shove, and where they that line is drawn around, how where they stand on the good and the good versus dark, and good versus dark is also relative. To a situation. It's situation specific, but it's just the resilience and that desire to live and move on and not want to live in hate. One thing I've never understood is people who can celebrate someone else's death. It doesn't matter how evil that person is. Like, I can't play God. I may want to put them in prison. I may want to get them um, out of a position of creating power, but not celebrating anyone's death.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and
I know,
what are the, well, what are the,
Hitler's awful, but I don't celebrate his death. I'm glad he's
right.
out of power.
No. That's, yes, I agree there. No. Where I'm going is, we live in a comfortable, and I'm not the first person to say this, we live in a comfortable time, right? For all the chaos, psychological mostly, but even financial, material. I mean, you can go online anywhere and you can read about how young men and young women aren't getting married, and the marriage, dating, family dynamic is all screwed up for people under the age of 35. Like, you can read that everywhere. There's all these hyperventilating thought pieces about all the chaos that's going on down there in the dating market. There are hyperventilating thought pieces written about artificial intelligence and large language models and how they're going to create deep fakes and deep fake the president and this and then that. There's arguments online about how, and in real life, about how well, the personal is political, right? Our identity. I mean, we're in the month of June, right? So we're gonna make our identity a political act, whether it's a racial identity, a class identity, a sexual orientation, or sexual identification identity. We're gonna make that a political act. And the fundamental nature of books like this, along with the Gulag Archipelago, and a few others, is that it forces us to move from things that are not serious or are fundamentally unserious to things that are serious, right? And that idea of just keeping going, that idea of persistence, but also persistence in an actual position based on principle, right? So you talked about Chris Cuomo. Chris Cuomo was an interesting cat to me because he doesn't think that he did anything incorrect with COVID, right? He was and that's fine. You're welcome to your
It's cognitive dissonance, right?
it's cognitive dissonance, right? Yeah, you're welcome to your thought process. That's fine, Chris, Mr. Cuomo. If I may. But I'm also okay to not forget. I can forgive, but I'm not going to forget. I'm not going to forget what you and the other talking, chattering class heads said on CNN during that time. I'm not going to forget the caterwauling that was on MSNBC. I'm not even going to forget the things that were said on Fox. I'm not ignorant. The internet is forever. Well, or it's the closest thing to forever that we've got, right? Yeah, that we've got currently. And so, words, look, should words have consequences? Absolutely. That's the sign of a mature individual, is you realize your words have consequences. And if you're speaking from a place of principles rather than a space of generating clicks, which, by the way, is comfortable, then you're going to actually say things that are meaningful and that matter. Otherwise, you're just going to say stuff for clickbait, and you're adding to the unseriousness. And so when something serious does come along that does need to be dealt with, you won't have the language, you won't have the tools to be able to deal with it. And that's what drives me crazy about the current moment we're in now. Like, materially, we're the most comfortable people on the planet ever to freaking exist in human history. And yet we are unwinding spiritually. And we don't have the words to describe why the unwinding is happening. We've robbed ourselves of our own language.
I mean, technology has just basically made it so you don't have to move. And so how do you that's, it's how do you, convince the rat not to take the next hit of cocaine, or the mouse? You just, it's all brain chemistry at this point, neurotransmitters, and just getting that hit and hit and hit, and the positive reinforcement of that or the negative reinforcement of that. I mean, I don't know, turn it into an app, trick people into like, take the lessons, and like, I can't help but think of, I remember when Oxycontin really hit on the scene, and I forget the politician's name, but it was in Massachusetts, and it was really big in the country to figure out laws and the criminality of it, and how, that sort of thing. And so this guy was like, hey, it was like a no strikes policy, go directly to jail, pass go, blah, blah, blah. And then 6 weeks later, something like that, his son overdosed on Oxycontin. It was like, this is the greatest tragedy that the world has ever seen. We have to change the laws and these are sick people. So until it affected him personally, he really didn't care.
Right.
And so, people, and I mean, people, it's not like, I guess to your point, how do you take your tragedy seriously? How do you take the thing that happened to you that should have killed you or could have killed you, and turn that into the most, I don't know, the best thing that's ever happened to you?
Yeah, everyone has a different, red pill, or, I'll call it just, I'll be provocative or not, but you have your own bottom, right?
Mm-hmm.
And everyone, well, those in recovery have different bottoms. We are in a dopamine right now. Everyone is, kids are filled with dopamine.
Mm-hmm.
All they do is touch a button and food comes to them. And to your point, the rat's not going to stop asking for the Coke until there's a moment that gets it out of its feedback loop and allows it to see something else to go chase. And so what is that moment that's going to break the pattern that people are in so they can wake up? For many, it was October 7th. But what's that next kind of, it's not enough. What's that next moment? And can we reset before we hit too far of a bottom?
Right. And by the way, that's the job of leaders. The job of leaders is to be fundamentally the people that say, this is the line. This is what we're doing. You don't get to go any further than this. Oh, well, we want to go further. No. Well, we'll throw you over and find a leader who can take us further. Okay, that's fine. One day, you're Winston Churchill and you're on the back bench and nobody wants to hear what you've got to say about Hitler. And the next day you're talking about the Battle of Britain and you're rallying the people. And then guess where guess where Churchill wound up back at? The back bench where no one wanted to listen to him. This is the price of leadership, right? The price of leadership isn't that you win a championship. It's not that you're Michael Jordan. Very often you get to be the leader, right? You get to be the leader, and then you're back into obscurity. And it's not glory seeking. And that's probably the part that's driving me most crazy.
Yeah.
Is in the example you were talking about with Ryan, the example you were talking about with the politician with Oxycontin. And I'm not saying that he wasn't tragically impacted by his son's death. I think for sure he probably was. That's the best solution he could think of, because that's the only, the only thing you got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Got it. I understand. That's my bugaboo, right? I've got this podcast and it's the hammer I use, right? I'm as guilty of it as anybody else. I am, right? And leadership fundamentally is the act of going through that cycle and ignoring the glory. If it comes, great. But more likely than not, you're going to wind up in obscurity on the back bench, and people are going to be like, I didn't like what you did. That's okay. We held the line. That's okay.
Yeah, for me, I'm thinking about like that will to survive, of of Eli's or even Beatles, Moisha. It's it's that drive to tell the story too, so it doesn't happen again, or so people are awake and prepared so that it doesn't happen to them. Like that can be a significant enough draws to help others with a message, to the point that our leaders, we have the me generation being my parents' generation, they're still the me generation. It's like they're not, they just want to be liked, and our Congress and our government is led by me's, and they just want to be liked. And we need folks who are okay. This is a theme that we've had in all of our podcasts, hey son, is that you need to be willing to make tough decisions. I don't want to be liked, I want to be respected, and the person I want to be respected by is myself. Right? And did I make the right tough decision? And too many people care about what others think. And it's not that I don't care, but it's a tough love. And we have too many spoiled children leading leading all levels of society right now who have never been said no. And they don't understand the consequences or care about the consequences of their actions. And that's why the whole West Coast is imploding.
It was one of I just remember the first week or two being in school is like, oh my God, we ruined these kids. I was like, oh my Jesus, look, everyone's like just like pounding Jolly Ranchers and hitting a computer, and it's just like, it's pretty wild. So to take a history, I think remaining open, like I had an old sponsor in AA who's a district attorney, and he said, I go into every court case, giving 2% to the other person, because I don't ever want to be in a situation where I think I know everything, and about that event, it kind of the end scene of Field of Dreams. I'm always reminded of in the situations where you like something's there, and it's like I don't refrain from certainty in such complex matters, I would say is probably. So that the guy in Field of Dreams, they're playing the game. They're playing the game on the field with all the old timers that are ghosts and invisible, and he's been fighting with, Kevin Costner the whole movie to sell the thing because of the field, because of the farm, and blah blah blah. And then he finally sees the players, and he's like, "Oh, you can't sell this farm. This is a magical place, and it's been here the entire time." So. That
well, and we'll go back to the book here because we got to turn the corner here. We got to talk about a couple of other things that are pressing upon this narrative. I will say this: one of the reasons why I do the podcast in the way that I do it is because, and I invite the people on who I want to talk to, is because adults in the room are the thing that's missing, and we use that phraseology to talk about politicians who maybe have reached a certain level of chronological maturity or biological maturity, but that doesn't mean that you're actually the adult. I know, but I currently, the place I live in, average age is 55 to 75. I know a lot of, and the very first weekend that we moved here, my wife and I went out and watched a couple of 60-year-old men get tossed out of a bar for behaving like 19-year-olds and getting into a bar fight. Right. So chronological and biological age is no indicator of being an adult. It's no indicator of behaving in a mature fashion. Right. And I think the thing that we're missing when we say we're missing adults in the room is we're missing that sense of gravitas. We're missing that sense of position and responsibility. We're missing that sense of, to Libby's point, being and doing and saying and leading on the unpopular thing so that a greater good can occur on the other side of it. Speaking of which, let's go back to the book. I'm going to read some pieces from this. It's a long section about the camp. So back to the book, back to Night by Elie Wiesel. The camp looked as though it had been through an epidemic, empty and dead. This is Buna. They had just arrived at Buna. It was a new concentration camp, new for them anyway. Only a few quote unquote well-dressed inmates were wandering between the blocks. Of course, we first had to pass through the showers. The head of the camp joined us there. He was a stocky man with big shoulders, the neck of a bull, thick lips, and curly hair. He gave an impression of kindness. From time to time, a smile would linger in his gray blue eyes. Our convoy included a few 10 and 12-year-olds. The officer took an interest in them and gave orders to bring them food. We were given new clothing and settled into tents. We were to wait there until we could be incorporated into work commandos. Then we would be assigned to a block. In the evening, the commandos returned from work yards, roll call. We began looking for people we knew, asking the veterans which work commandos were the best and which block one should try to enter. All the inmates agreed. Buna is a very good camp. One can hold one's own here. The most important thing is to not be assigned to the construction commando. As if we had a choice. Our tent leader was a German, an assassin's face, fleshy lips, hands resembling wolf's paws. The camp's food had agreed with him. He could hardly move. He was so fat. Like the head of the camp, he liked children. Immediately after our arrival, he had bread brought for them, some soup and margarine. In fact, this affection was not entirely altruistic. There existed here a veritable traffic of children among homosexuals, I learned later. He told us, "You will stay with me for 3 days in quarantine. Afterward, you will go to work. Tomorrow, medical checkup." One of his aides, a tough-looking boy with shifty eyes, came over to me. "Would you like to get into a good commando?" "Of course, but on one condition. I want to stay with my father." "All right," he said, "I can arrange it for a pittance. Your shoes. I'll give you another pair." I refused to give him my shoes. They were all I had left. "I'll also give you a ration of bread with some margarine." He liked my shoes. I would not let him have them. Later, they were taken from me anyway, in exchange for nothing that time. The medical checkup took place outside early in the morning before 3 doctors seated on a bench. The first hardly examined me. He just asked, "Are you in good health?" Who would have dared to admit the opposite? On the other hand, the dentist seemed more conscientious. He asked me to open my mouth wide. In fact, he was not looking for decay, but for gold teeth. Those who had gold in their mouths were listed by their number. I did have a gold crown. The first 3 days went by quickly. On the 4th day, as we stood in front of our tent, the capos appeared. Each one began to choose the men he liked. You. They pointed their fingers the way one might choose cattle or merchandise. We followed our capo, a young man. He made us halt at the door of the first block near the entrance to the camp. This was the orchestra's block. He motioned us inside. We were surprised. What had we to do with music? The orchestra was playing a military march, always the same. Dozens of commandos were marching off in step to the workyards. The capos were beating the time. Left, right, left, right. SS officers, pen in hand, recorded the number of men leaving. The orchestra continued to play the same march until the last commando had passed. And then the conductor's baton stopped moving and the orchestra fell silent. The capo yelled, "Fall in!" We fell into ranks of 5 with the musicians. We left the camp without music, but in step. We still had the march in our ears. Left, right, left, right. We struck up a conversation with our neighbors, the musicians. Almost all of them were Jews. Juliak, a Pole with glasses and a cynical smile and a pale face. Louis, a native of Holland, a well-known violinist. He complained that they would not let him play Beethoven. Jews were not allowed to play German music. Hans, the young man from Berlin, was full of wit. The foreman was a Pole, Franek, a former student in Warsaw. Juliak explained to me, "We work at a warehouse of electrical materials not far from here. The work is neither difficult nor dangerous. Only Idek, the capo, occasionally has fits of madness, and then you'd better stay out of his way." "You are lucky, little fellow," said Hans, smiling. "You fell into a good commando." Then they go, I'm going to move ahead a little bit. They move through the warehouse, and they talk about having a Jewish person as their leader, named Alfonso. And then this, one day when we had just returned from the warehouse, I was summoned by the block secretary. A7713, That's me. After your meal, you'll go to see the dentist, but I don't have a toothache. After your meal, without fail. I went to the infirmary block. Some 20 prisoners are waiting in line at the entrance. It didn't take long to learn the reason for our summons. Our gold teeth were to be extracted. The dentist, a Jew from Czechoslovakia, had a face not unlike a death mask. When he opened his mouth, one had a ghastly vision of yellow, rotten teeth. Seated in the chair, I asked meekly, "What are you going to do, sir?" "I shall remove your gold crown, that's all," he said, clearly indifferent. I thought of pretending to be sick. "Couldn't you wait a few days, sir? I don't feel well. I have a fever." He wrinkled his brow, thought for a moment, and then took my pulse. "All right, son, come back and see me when you feel better, but don't wait for me to call you." I went back to see him a week later. With the same excuse, I still was not feeling better. He did not seem surprised, and I don't know whether he believed me. Yet he was pleased that I had come back on my own. As I had promised, he granted me a further delay. A few days after my visit, the dentist's office was shut down. He had been thrown into prison and was about to be hanged. It appeared he had been dealing in prisoners' gold teeth for his own benefit. I felt no pity for him. In fact, I was pleased with what was happening to him. My gold crown was safe. It could be useful to me one day to buy something, some bread, or even time to live. At that moment in time, all that mattered to me was my daily bowl of soup, my crust of stale bread. The bread, the soup, those were my entire life. I was nothing but a body, perhaps even less a famished stomach. The stomach alone was measuring time. We're going to turn a corner here and talk about one of the scourges of our day, an old disease. An old disease that has now come back. For barely educated Ivy League college students on the political left claiming that Israel is a colonizing nation state and Zionism is quote unquote racism, the barely qualified Patriot Front shills on Substack squawking about quote unquote Zionist conspiracies to control the world. Antisemitism has yet again reared its ugly old head, this time in America. The idea, and this is my fundamental problem with both the right and the left on this, but the idea that the Jewish people are simultaneously pulling all the strings in the world, as well as victimizing populations in the Middle East without cause, while also claiming to be victims themselves, is a canard older than the protocols of Zion and just as false. Now, I have a visceral response to anti-Semitism. It actually makes my gut turn over. And I think that's a sign that I'm still human. I still have a moral core. I believe fundamentally as Christians, we are called to protect Jewish people. Does that mean that we are called to advance Jewish ideas or advance Jewish thoughts or whatever? No, but there's a fine line between critiquing and falling into everybody's ruling the world everywhere nonsense. And unfortunately, because we don't have a maturity of thought, like we just talked about in our last section, and because we lack adults in the room, we don't know where the line is. We don't know how to have these conversations anymore. And this seems to have surprised people on the political left in the United States more so than anybody else. I mean, people on the political right are always getting lambasted from the Ku Klux Klan, from the Ku Klux Klan to, you know, whatever, as Ryan was talking about, whatever, you know, the Proud Boys are doing, all the way to the Patriot Front. You know, please, the right in America has always been whacked with anti-Semitism, but the left, the question the left can't answer in our time, which seems to flummox them, is when do you know when the left has gone too far? It seems to fundamentally flummox them. And partially this is because there's never enough Marxist revolution. Partially it's also they are ill-educated on the fact of Stalin and Mao and the gulags and Pol Pot and the re-education camps in China and all this, and North Korea. My God, North Korea. I mean, an entire nation state devoted to the actual logical end of Marxism. Stalin's gulags killed millions of Jews along with many, many other people. And the political left has never repudiated that, but they've also never allowed that to be laid at their feet. Now, they'll claim that they've repudiated it, but yet and still, you keep talking about Marxist ideas. So if you genuinely repudiated it, you'd probably not be talking about Marxist collectivism.
But I think there's something that we're missing here.
Yeah, go ahead. What are we missing?
Maybe this time it might work.
Right, the old canard. We're smarter. You're right.
This is different.
This is different. Yeah, we're better people because we've got dopamine inducing devices in our hands. We have to be better people, right? What do we do with this? Why is the shadow of anti-Semitism growing long in our culture? And what do we do to push back on this? How do we punch this in the mouth? Like people talk about, oh, punch Hitler. Like people on the left were talking about that a few years ago. And I was just like, what are we doing? What are we doing? Oh, of course, maybe this is a what do you call it? A nemesis showing up to the political left. And a nemesis is always sort of an equal and opposite reaction for something that happens for something that you do when you go too far, when you go into an excess. I don't know. But there's always a spiritual element to anti-Semitism, as we've been talking about also on this podcast, as well as an intellectual and fundamentally, of course, from reading Night, a physical element. There's a clearing at the end of the path with that crap. So how do we push back against this? What's our best practices here? I know Libby likes best practices.
But I mean, I really appreciate how it has influenced the expression of art and literature. I mean, Vonnegut has a book called Mother Night. Mm-hmm. That is influence and it's kind of about the World War II and Nazi Germany. I found this on the street walking by a meter, like one of those kiosks to parking lot meter, mm-hmm. and started reading.
Oh, Mouse, yes. Yes.
There's a better.
Yes, I love that. Yeah, that's a great graphic novel.
And you know, the sort of the parables can be in any way, shape, or form. Mm-hmm. And so art and literature has kind of always been, or music has just been my go-to. Or just being kind, going out of my way to be kind, like being proactive in our community. I mean, how often, it's funny, some comedians talk about like, yeah, when you were, your kids, somebody would knock on the door, you'd have company. You'd have, you have guests, your mom would get like the Entenmann's or whatever, mm-hmm. make some coffee and hang out and talk. Be like a Tuesday night, you just having like friends, your parents are over and hanging out. And now it's like somebody knocks on the door, everyone jumps in a closet and is like, who's knocking at the door? Like suspicious, right. Suspicious.
So we push back by building community, is what you're saying, mm-hmm. and using art and literature.
For sure. Building community, we realize how much more similar we are than different, right? Unfortunately, with this, maternalism that's out there right now, if someone feels uncomfortable, we want to remove them from a situation, as opposed to, if you understand how your primitive brain that's been wired for billions of years works, if something's new, it automatically is on alert. It doesn't mean that new is bad. So push through and live with curiosity about your fellow humans, and you'll be pleasantly surprised. I think I actually think humanity is really great. I've lived in all types of communities, rural, urban, suburban, rich, poor, diverse, not diverse. And I find, humans actually are really decent. It's our leaders who will tell us that they're not. And I remember the first time I went to Europe in 1994, I went to France, and I'd been told that the French were awful. And I was like, oh my God, they're awesome. Like, they're just like you and me, and we're not our governments. And we need to, one, remember we're not our governments. I think we're too many countries and people like Israel. The government is not necessarily representative of the people. We need to be cognizant of that. I also, all of my cultural references, Bill Maher had a guest on Friday night that was saying, that was, the woman from The View was like, we just need people to be more educated. And the guy was saying, well, how many movies and books can you have, about like the Holocaust? Like, I mean, we've had tons. And I think what's missing is the real root cause is not being addressed. It's the Marxist, when I listen to a lot of my friends on the left talk about it, they try to send it back to the right. Or they divert to another conversation. They can't fathom that the traditional liberals, which are great, has been infiltrated by these by Marxist extremes. And the reason that we're seeing the anti-Semitism, it's that the haves versus the have-nots. So because they're in positions of power, and because of the communities that they have, because they tend to support their families, value education, value hard work, instead of copying them and saying these are the things that are necessary to be successful, we want to bring the oppressors, the successful down, the oppressor versus the oppressed, the oppressor versus the oppressed, and that's the Marxist ideology. And the fact that no one's talked about Stalin and Mao for decades, they only talk about Hitler, has been you can't underestimate the power of rhetoric and the intentionality of it. Look over here, not here, because we're here, and so actually understanding a lot of the root cause and pushing that out, just like the right pushes out the lunatics on the far right. But if you don't understand some of the root cause, and that you've been infiltrated, and willing to fight against, fight your own, like the right always fights its own, the left rarely does. And you need to fight, to push the toxins out. But
so is okay, so something occurs to me, Libby, and I'm going to ask you this question here. I'm going to direct this directly to you.
Can I interject 1 second?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I'll hold on to my question. Go ahead.
So it sounds like peer review, and so what I'm listening to, and okay, and there's who's the teacher in Portland State that just did the fake paper? And
what's his name? Yeah, exactly.
So,
it is just like peer review. It is.
And so we see what happened with peer review. So what is the intervention to put in place for the thing that was the safeguard?
I don't know. It's the same, like, FDA people just quit who weren't aligned with what, with the vax being mandated. Corporate, many of the reasons a lot of us opt out of senior positions in corporate is because it's just groupthink. It's not about learning and creating and building. It's about, maintaining, maintaining status, maintaining income. It's not about building or creating. And if you are a change agent, you will be ejected, right? So the question is, how do you change it? And another theme, you got to build it from the outside in. Changing the institutions is incredibly challenging. You have to do it outside in with different models.
So the question that occurs
like
to me.
third parties.
Third party, yeah. Well, okay. So you
Or small businesses, local
Yeah.
community development.
alternative media landscapes, like all these kinds of
Yeah.
going out on the long tail, which we've knocked the internet a couple of times here today, rightly so, and we've knocked social media, rightly so. But the benefits or the upside of those tools, and they are tools, and we'll talk about tools here in just a moment when we turn the corner. But the upside of using those tools is you are able to create an alternative landscape, an alternative media culture, or even an alternative production culture. You talk about anti-Semitism being this thing on the left, and this is directed to Libby, is I think you probably heard of this concept, and even Ryan sort of tapped into it with the idea of peer review, status, income. These are all things that are, quite frankly, to borrow from Rob Henderson, luxury beliefs, right? And it's not to say that people who are in the middle class or the working class or poor folks don't have these systems too. They're just set up differently. Okay. Anti-Semitism has always been hot among the academic elite, particularly the academic elite that run Princeton and Harvard. I mean, initially, those elite Ivy League universities were designed to keep Jews out. And it was only after World War II that Jewish people were allowed in. So the idea that there's this Zionist conspiracy in the Ivy League that's spreading out, stop. Like, let's just stop it, okay? Because those systems were designed by WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, to keep Jews out, okay? Specifically Jews and blacks and women. Those are the three big categories. And then Catholic, if you wanted a fourth category thrown in there just for good measure. Okay. I know the history. I've actually read the books. Okay. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does echo or rhyme. And so are we just now at a space where this is now being taken up now, this anti-Semitism, this new strain, is just being taken up as just another luxury belief by the elites, by the people who run things? Because it's not, I don't see people protesting the Israelis doing whatever it is they're doing in Gaza. I don't see some middle-class kid from, some state school protesting this. This is not the people who I hear yelling about this. I'm instead hearing about this from some undergraduate whose parents spent $250,000 on them to go to Columbia.
Because they don't live in the real world.
Right.
Yeah.
Like it's the same thing of, why Wiesel, survived the camps. He just pushed through. He didn't have time to think. He's just surviving, right?
Right.
He didn't have time to think about and over intellectualize. Like I've lived in these intellectual circles, and they think their thoughts are real. Just because they thought it and they can think it quickly and they can make correlations, they think it's real. They're so removed from, working with your hands, working close, to them, it's menial and not meaningful. Like the intellectual masturbation is what brings meaning. But it's also where all civilizations find their deaths. In the othering, like just think of the French Revolution, same thing. Bolsheviks. Why is it in the intellectual? Because they need to find something to solve for, and they just
think they're guilt. I personally believe, if you're asking me, I personally believe that the ease with which people get material gain leads to a concomitant decline in spiritual appreciation of that gain. So the more
material, they didn't work for it or earn it, and there's meaning and that it's meaning in the work.
Right. Well, you see this in the first generation. Okay. So any family that's wealthy in America, the very first generation, you know this, Libby, and Ryan, you see this, right? They
three
are
generations.
Right. Shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in three generations. That's right. Yeah. And so that first generation is religious, sometimes shockingly evangelistic. They're the people who, like, they go to church, they make the money, they align everything, boom, they're ready to go, right? Their kids come in, and their kids are, to my point earlier about a bad copy of a copy, they're a bad copy of the original. Sometimes they keep the thing going, most times they don't. And then by the time their kids come around, that third generation, it's all gone, right? The money's been spent on wine, women, song. We already mentioned cocaine. Don't have to mention that again, but it's already been blown through, right? And now that third generation is back to starting from scratch, right? Just to claw up something out of existence. Okay. The really wealthy families, though, the ones who manage to get past that third, in some cases, that fourth or fifth generation of wealth transfer, right? I think the reason that those, and that's who we're talking about, that's what we mean as elites. I think the reason why those folks are captured by these luxury ideas is because, and I don't think it's any more complicated than this. Sometimes Occam's razor is correct, and this is an Occam's razor situation. I think those people are just bored. I think they're bored. They're bored and they lack creativity.
They have no purpose. I mean, I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, like, people not working. I'm like, there's dignity, especially with small businesses being killed. It's like there's dignity in work. People don't want, like, the whole concept of UBI. Like, people want, there's dignity in work, and earning something. And with that shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves, what happens with the second generation is they realize the money doesn't fill you, it doesn't complete you, right? But they don't know, but they're told work is like, where's this thing? I also think this is maybe a Bill Maher, another cultural reference, but concept of, like, where did or maybe it was Vivek. I think it was Vivek Ramaswamy on Sean Ryan. And he was talking about the concept of retirement and how we're told, that you just need to work until you retire, right? But most, up until the 21st century, people didn't retire; they worked their whole lives,
right?
Like, when you retire, then what? Like, live on the beach? That's fun for a little while, but there's dignity in producing. So I do think there's something about the concept of they're bored. Well, and then they're guilty about it and taking it out on you.
Right, like, exactly. Right? Yeah. Like
they resent you for actually having meaning in your life.
They're bored. They're full of resentment. They have a weird form of envy. Like, we've talked about this on the podcast before, and I actually wrote a post about this recently on, like, my Facebook page somewhere, about how fathers are responsible for keeping the envy machine in their children's hearts turned off, because once that is turned on, then anybody can tell them anything. And the envy machine gets turned on from social media. It gets turned on from getting into the comparison trap with other people's highlight reels. The best thing you could do if you're a fifth generation family with wealth is to get that kid who's got wealth and put him to work in, like, a lumber yard or something. Like, that's the best thing you could do for that kid when they're like 14. And guess what? You don't get to go to the lumber yard in your Rolls Royce. You get to go to the lumber yard on your bike, and you're going to go work, right? And I do think there are some families who understand that. I do think there are some families who get that, but I think that they are in unsexy fields. And so I think the less sexy the field is where you make money. Like, I met a guy the other day who's a coal miner, right? I never actually met a coal miner in real life. And he's telling me all these great stories about coal mining in the mountains and all of this. And, he was like, this is really hard work, And he's like, have you ever thought about being a coal miner? And I said, that is not something that was ever offered to me as an option on the plate. I mean, I knew people.
Coal miner?
Right. Like, I knew people who did it. I now have met people who have done it. I met somebody who has done it, but that was not something, and it's probably a little late for me. I'm in my 40s now. You probably don't want me crawling around underground trying to dig out bituminous coal. It's probably not something you want to do.
In 2024, someone asked that question. That's awesome.
But it's an awesome question, right? And so, to overcome those luxury beliefs, we have to give people, Libby, to your point, I think, material not only material meaning, but we don't understand how material meaning and psychological meaning and spiritual meaning all link together. We have no clue. We're just beginning to pull apart consciousness. We really don't understand. But all those things do link together somehow, and they create the fundamental structure of reality, the Dyson sphere of reality that we're all trying to hold together out here. Ryan, any thoughts before I turn the corner here?
No, I don't think so.
All right.
This was well, yeah, I do. Now that I look down at my notes. So, talking about the simple writing. So just saying things that create such an image and are so simple and are really, really beautiful. He describes someone as having an assassin's face.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't know an assassin. Do you know any assassins?
No.
Do you know what that means? Do you know an assassin's face when you see one, though? You know, our very skin was aching.
Mm-hmm.
I can't like that's pretty dark. If your skin is aching, a face not unlike a death mask is how he described the dentist. And there was a weird compassion, and so I wrote down the human condition also. And so when he says, I don't feel well. There's something in the dentist that says, yeah, you know what? He sees the kid as a kid, or he sees someone, he may see him for what he is at that moment, like someone stuck in this horrible position with a gold tooth and he doesn't feel well. And so, you know what? If he says he feels crappy, I don't want to make him feel any crappier. Hmm. And that's kind of like a ray of light in the darkness. And I'm sure that wasn't the dentist's intention, but it's almost like Libby saying, talking about like life's purpose is to continue living. That's why you pick up a board and you'll see like a tiny piece of grass growing and it hasn't seen light in forever. So yeah, that's just kind of the thing. So that's my, I would say, final thoughts.
All right. Well, back to the book. The last little bit here. Last piece of Night here by Elie Wiesel. So we're going to turn the corner. We're going to start talking about solutions to problems, because on this podcast this year, and probably next year too, because we're opening up a can of worms on a lot of big problems, not just on this episode, but on other episodes. And so we're going to talk about solutions to problems that Elie Wiesel has postulated to us in Night, and that challenge us as leaders. So back to the book. The summer was coming to an end. The Jewish year was almost over. On the eve of Rosh Hashanah, the last day of that cursed year, the entire camp was agitated and every one of us felt the tension. After all, this was a day unlike all others, the last day of the year. The word last has an odd ring to it. What if it really were the last day? The evening meal was distributed, and especially thick soup, but nobody touched it. We wanted to wait until after prayer. On the apple plots, surrounded by electrified barbed wire, thousands of Jews, anguish on their faces, gathered in silence. Night was falling rapidly, and more prisoners kept coming from every block, suddenly able to overcome time and space to will both into submission. What are you, my God? I thought angrily. How do you compare to the stricken mass gathered to affirm to you their faith, their anger, their defiance? What does your grandeur mean, master of the universe, in the face of all this cowardice, this decay, and this misery? Why do you go on troubling these poor people's wounded minds, their ailing bodies? Some 10,000 men had come to participate in a solemn service, including the Blockelteste, the capos, all bureaucrats in the service of death. Blessed be the Almighty. The voice of the officiating inmate had just become audible. At first, I thought it was the wind. Blessed be God's name. Thousands of lips repeated the benediction, bent over like trees in a storm. Blessed be God's name. Why would I bless him? Every fiber in me rebelled, because he caused thousands of children to burn in his mass graves, because he kept 6 crematoria working day and night, including Sabbath and the holy days, because in his great might he had created Auschwitz, Birkenau, Buna, and so many other factories of death. How could I say to him, blessed be thou, almighty master of the universe, who chose us among all nations to be tortured day and night, to watch as our fathers, our mothers, our brothers ended up in the furnaces? Praise be thy holy name. for having chosen us to be slaughtered in on thine altar? I listened as the inmate's voice rose. It was powerful yet broken amid the weeping, the sobbing, the sighing of the entire congregation. All the earth and the universes are God's. He kept pausing, as though he lacked the strength to uncover the meaning beneath the text. The melody was stifled in his throat. And I, the former mystic, was thinking, yes, man is stronger, greater than God. When Adam and Eve deceived you, you chased them from paradise. When you were displeased by Noah's generations, you brought down the flood. When Sodom lost your favor, you caused the heavens to rain down fire and damnation. But look at these men whom you have betrayed, allowing them to be tortured, slaughtered, gassed, and burned. What do? They pray before you. They praise your name. All of creation bears witness to the greatness of God. In days gone by, Rosh Hashanah had dominated my life. I knew that my sins grieved the Almighty, and so I pleaded for forgiveness. In those days, I fully believed that the salvation of the world depended on every one of my deeds, on every one of my prayers. But now, I no longer plead for anything. I was no longer able to lament. On the contrary, I felt very strong. I was the accuser, God the accused. My eyes had opened, and I was alone, terrible alone in the world, without God, without man, without love or mercy. I was nothing but ashes now. But I felt myself to be stronger than this Almighty to whom my life had been bound for so long. In the midst of these men assembled for prayer, I felt like an observer, a stranger. The service ended with Kaddish, each of us reciting Kaddish for his parents, for his children, and for himself. We remained standing in the apple plots for a long time, unable to detach ourselves from this surreal moment. Then came the time to go to sleep, and slowly the inmates returned to their blocks. I thought I heard them wishing each other a happy new year. I ran to look for my father. At the same time, I was afraid of having to wish him a happy new year, in which I no longer believed. He was leaning against the wall, bent shoulders sagging as if under a heavy load. I went up to him, took his hand and kissed it. I felt a tear on my hand. Whose was it? Mine? His? I said nothing, nor did he. Never before had we understood each other so clearly. The sound of the bell brought us back to reality. We had to go to bed. We came back from very far away. I looked at my father's face, trying to glimpse a smile or something like it on his stricken face, but there was nothing. Not the shadow of an expression. Defeat. Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, should we feast? The question was hotly debated. To fast could mean a more certain, more rapid death. In this place, we were always fasting. It was Yom Kippur year-round. But there were those who said we should fast precisely because it was dangerous to do so. We needed to show God that even here, locked in hell, we were capable of singing his praises. I did not fast. First of all, to please my father, who had forbidden me to do so. And then there was no longer any reason for me to fast. I no longer accepted God's silence. As I swallowed my ration of soup, I turned that act into a symbol of rebellion, of protest against him. And I nibbled on my crust of bread. Deep inside me, I felt a great void opening.
The God-shaped hole. There's a book called Case for Christ.
Yes, go ahead, Case for Christ. I was going to bring that up. Yeah, go ahead.
And I was reading it. I was working at a coffee shop, and this couple was sitting outside. Oh, this couple was sitting outside, and this guy Mike, who helped me buy my car, and he was a devout Christian,
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, "Oh, you're reading that book?" And it wasn't a couple; it was just him. You're reading that book? I said, "Yeah." He goes, "So it proved to exist," and I was like, "Doesn't matter." And he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Like, if someone proved that he didn't, I'm not gonna like kill you because now it's, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
So the something to a positive. It's like the intention and the practice is the intention to distract from whatever the brain is currently pressed up against, in order to like rewire it, in order to like safeguard through uncompromisable situations, essentially.
Well, and Wiesel hits on something that Solzhenitsyn hit on in the Gulag Archipelago, where he talked about how there were people who went into the Gulag as rock-ribbed Eastern Orthodox Christians in Russia, and they came out, to paraphrase from, well, not to paraphrase, but to quote from Wiesel, with a great void that had opened up inside of them because of the things they had seen. And then there were people who I would maybe categorize them as Sam Harris atheists, because it's cool and intellectual and to be atheistic now because it's easy and comfortable. It doesn't cost you anything other than maybe a little bit of social approbation from certain geographic sectors of the country who you don't care about anyway. So what the hell do you care? You get all the right claps from all the right people. So it's easy. But those people went into the Gulag. And some of them were true believers in Marxism, speaking of that. And they wound up actually coming out believing in God. And so Wiesel is onto something here. Like there's a journey, right, that he went on. And I think about this as a person who tries every day to be the best Christian that I can be. And most days I miss the mark. Most days I fall into hamartia, which is sin. I miss the mark. It's an archery term. That's all sin means. And just because, and this is the point of Jesus, just because you fall into sin doesn't mean that God has forgotten you. It doesn't mean that God has stopped talking. It just means that the void or the gap, the chasm between you and him is or you and it, if we want to frame it without gendering it in our era, is wide, right? The void is wide between you and being. And so I read that section right there, and it struck me that and Libby talks about the book, bringing her to tears. That part right there, that entire section right there, struck me so deeply. Judaism is a fascinating religion. And the day of having days for atonement, right? Having days for New Year's. I love that idea, right? Where there's going to be a day where you're going to talk about all the ways you've missed the mark. You're going to ask for forgiveness. And yes, that can turn into religion. And yes, that can become rote. And yes, that could become performative. And it has for many Jewish people. They're not immune to that. But there is value in that performative act. I don't know where the value lies, because who knows what's in a man's heart, right? But there's value in that, even in the midst of, and this is what he was hitting on here, even in the midst of hell. Even in the midst of hell. We're told in the New Testament that the demons know the name of Jesus. They know the name. That's what we're told. That is fascinating to me. That is fascinating. They don't worship Jesus, but they know the name.
It's interesting, you talk about we were talking about like rock bottoms earlier.
Mm-hmm.
This sounds like his spiritual rock bottom. And something else, we were talking about solutions, and this, because the internet is, and we talked about this, has made so many people an expert.
Mm-hmm.
It's difficult to remain teachable, and so remaining teachable. Well, we did talk about that earlier, but still, just remaining teachable in situation, I think, is so important. Is still kind of like approach something with an open mind, and how and then how do we do that?
Yeah.
And that is Libby, on your point of like starting outside in, is like, well, that happens from how you raise your children. I'm sure how you raise your children, Hassan. You value remaining teachable. And you're a great teacher. And so I think with great teachers, you're probably cultivating good students. And not only students for educational and academia, but students of life, because we all have to get through it. And so, I think remaining a good example, and, not wasting a rock bottom is a potential path to solution, or a solution. And it has to come down to the individual, because you've got to heal yourself before you can heal anybody else. So.
Yep. Libby,
I do,
final thoughts, solutions to
yeah, I mean,
problems.
I do think, the analogy that you were using earlier on, or reference to Schultz and Nietzsche and those intellectuals who went in atheist and came out believing.
Hmm.
You've seen a resurgence of religion, I won't say religiosity because that's a movie that counters religion, but uh, focus on more organized religion or community-based religion.
Mhm.
I think many did hit a bottom. But I think what I can only speak to myself, when I hit my bottom and I decided I chose life over death, once you know how close you are to death and that you're choosing life, like you don't, like, I know there's something greater than myself. I don't know what it is, but I'm powered by it.
Mhm.
And I don't have certainty about life. I live with a very curious and open mind. I think uh, I actually, one of the reasons I went into that dark
Mhm.
cauldron was because I was curious and interested about life. And that was, others tried to shut that out. And have you only live a certain way or be a certain way. And that wasn't, true to my essence. And when I think about what Wiesel was saying, is he was praying to a God, but what he really felt was he actually touched the true essence of spirituality and not the intellectualization of it.
Yep.
And once, I can say that, with like Russell Brand,
Mhm.
and others, is like you get to that point where it's not words. You actually have felt the essence of it. And there is something greater than yourself. Um, and it actually allows a freedom and safety to love and to be open and to be curious, because you know what the alternative is and it's not a place worth living in.
Yeah.
But of all places, I read a quote on a Starbucks cup many years ago that said, "There's freedom in commitment." And that's what that made me remind me of, is, what you just said, Libby.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of like discipline is freedom.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Jocko showing up here at the end of the podcast,
Same idea,
loping
right?
through. Yeah, the Holocaust is a serious subject,
Yeah.
and Wiesel is a serious writer about that. And this is a serious book. One of the problems that we have to solve for is how do we get people to take the lessons of history seriously? And I think it's really hard because we live in a world of robotics and artificial intelligence and putting people into orbit and instantaneous communication and reusable rockets. These are all a thing. And yet, with all our stuff, we are blind to the facts of human nature, right? We're blind to jealousy and envy and vanity and pride and lust for power. And the big one, fear, that still rule the human heart. There's a great quote that was in the graphic novel Watchmen by Alan Moore. He quoted from Albert Einstein. I love this quote. When I think about the Holocaust, I think about this. He says, and I quote, "The release of atomic power has changed everything except our way of thinking. The solution to this problem lies in the heart of mankind. If only I had known, I should have become a watchmaker." Albert Einstein was correct. By the way, a guy who barely avoided going to Auschwitz himself. And the Nazis would have burned him up in a crematorium in a second. The release of any kind of power, whether it's the power to wield control through laws and regulations over other men because you don't like them, or the power to make some sort of clickbaity headline, that kind of power. And the postmodernists are correct on this. The power relationships do change everything. but they don't change our way of thinking. We've never come up with a technological solution for the human heart, and we never will. I feel fairly, I feel comfortable in ontological certainty on saying that. And it's okay if I'm wrong. If I'm wrong on that one, fine. I'll accept being wrong on that, but I'll take the ontological Pepsi challenge on that.
I mean, I just love what you said. The quote, "If you lick my heart, you'd be pulled." You know, that's
Yeah.
another. Like, that quote is so unreal, man. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, it's. I think about these things. Oh, when I think about history and I think about the cycles of history, and I think about how we fail to appreciate the cyclical nature of history, we get deluded by progress, and we forget that there's all these old energies in the heart, right? All these old energies inside of folks. And I'm really concerned that we've abandoned our access, not abandoned the language, we've abandoned our access to the language of the near religious to describe the things that we see and experience. We try to use psychological language because psychology is a secular religion, but it's so thin on the ground. It doesn't get to the heart of what we actually want to say about the experience.
I actually think it goes deeper than that. I think people aren't in touch with their own feelings.
Yeah.
With their own feelings. Yeah. So that, everything is about external validation or numbing.
Mm-hmm.
So people don't even have access to really how they truly feel.
Yeah.
So to have the words to express it, all they get are the signals of fear and or numbing. But the solution for me is just continue to model healthy living. What does it mean to have a healthy body, mind, and spirit? A living life like happy, joyful, curious, and building and creating. It's easy to destroy and be judgmental, and that can feed your need to feel powerful, but your heart is feeling empty. And how are you? Those who live like that, what are they doing to numb? Because their heart is hollow or feeling hollow. I would just continue to model from outside in. I know there's lots of people who want what you've got, from a curiosity and, freedom of expression and living an empowered life. There's a lot of people who want that. They just don't know how to access it. So to be available to those who want it, but it's got to be outside in, decentralized, starting at your local community.
That's awesome. It makes me think of like how ayahuasca has become popular in Hollywood, and it's like we want the immediate, like you're searching, you're going through all this trouble to get the thing that you can do just sitting in your chair. And like the immediacy of that, like I want my spirituality right now. I want to be spiritually healed right now. I want to go to South America. I want to do some ancient sagacious thing and drink something and throw up and be like, I've talked to the people. Now I'm better.
Yeah, people can't just sit still, and actually feel, right? Turn off everything. Stop putting stuff in your body. Physically and spiritually, and just you have the answers. You just have to go within, and that can be uncomfortable. And we don't like being uncomfortable.
We don't like being uncomfortable. No, we don't. But you know what? The lessons of history. I mean, history is supposed to make us uncomfortable. It's supposed to feel bad. It's supposed to. You're supposed to feel. Well, no, shame and guilt are signals that at the root there is something else going on. And if we get caught in a shame or guilt spiral, that's a different kind of thing. But when I read Night, or when I read Eichmann in Jerusalem, or when I read Letters from Prison by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, or when I read Maus, right? Or when I watch movies or films, to your point, the Bill Maher guest, how many more movies or films do we need, right? Well, it's not how many more we need. It's how long is it going to take for us watching the ones we've already got to actually internalize the lesson? Not so we don't do it again, but so that we recognize that we have to change. That we need to go on a journey to changing our hearts. Not a journey to make our movies better, not a journey to make our literature better, not a journey to make our technology better, not a journey even to make our leadership better, but a journey to make our hearts better. People talk about epic journeys, right? Epic hero journeys. That's an epic hero's journey. If you can go on that journey using the path of history and literature and books and, yes, even technology, well, maybe we could avoid, maybe we could avoid or at least ameliorate the next great evil that's going to come from human hands. I'd like to thank Libby and Ryan for coming on the podcast today. This was a hard book to get through, and you'll see it on the video. It's a hard book to get through, and you'll probably hear it in our voices. But this is the point of doing these kinds of shows. So I hope that you enjoyed listening today to the Leadership Lessons for the Great Books podcast. Once again, thank you to Libby and Ryan for coming on. And with that, well, we're out. Thank you for listening to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast today. And now that you've made it this far, you should subscribe to the audio version of this show on all the major podcast players, including Apple iTunes, Spotify, YouTube Music, and everywhere else where podcasts are available. There's also a video version of our podcast on our YouTube channel. Like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the Leadership Toolbox channel on YouTube. Just search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button there on YouTube. And while you're doing that, leave a 5-star review if you like what we're doing here on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Just go below the player and hit 5 stars. We need those reviews to grow, and it's the easiest way to help grow this show. And tell all your friends, of course, in leadership. By the way, if you don't like what we're doing here, well, you can always listen to another leadership show. There are several other good ones out there. At least that's what I've heard. All right. Well, that's it for me.